And dignitaries on the dais, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first thank the organizers for inviting me and also accommodating at the last minute. My apologies for having to actually leave a little earlier. So Mr. Kocher, I think, has already highlighted that for us to be able to achieve the goal of a $5 trillion economy by 24-25 and a $10 trillion economy by 2030, we need to press the pedal on structural reforms. What I'm going to do is spend some time on the reforms that the government has undertaken and try and explain it, put it in perspective, and why that is important. So in the economic survey that we released in July this year, we laid out the strategic blueprint for us to become the $5 trillion economy with the special emphasis on investment as the key driver for economic development, with consumption being a force multiplier. And I must mention that in arriving at this conclusion, we looked at all countries that grew at least 5% over at least a decade since the Second World War. So all countries that grew at 5% plus for at least a decade since the Second World War, to try and infer what is it that these countries did right, so that we could essentially learn from those experiences to to lay out the path for what India should be following. And what comes out very clearly is that it's investment that is the most important for growth, because investment, and that's what we talked about, is the virtuous cycle. Investment is important for enhancing productivity in the economy, and it's productivity that eventually then improves wages, improves creates jobs, enhances exports. And then, the combination of all these put purchasing power in the hands of the consumer, which is what manifests as demand. The anticipation of demand is what then, companies use to actually make make investments, and that's how this virtuous cycle ends up proceeding. So what we've had over the last few quarters is this virtuous cycle not moving as fast as it was when we were growing at 7% plus. And it's here that the structural reforms become really critical. So I'm going to lay out a few factors that are really critical. When an investor thinks about making an investment, the simple trade-off that the investor does is to look at the risk of that investment and the after-tax return that the investor makes. And I mentioned the after-tax return, and therefore taxes become extremely critical. It's also important to understand here, sometimes there are these comparisons that are made saying that, the corporation is getting taxed at, let's say, 25% or 15% if it is making, new investments in the next 5 years, while individuals are getting taxed at, let's say, at a higher percent, at 33%. Is that fair? Is it equitable? That's a question that gets asked. What is important to understand here is that, after a corporation pays taxes, whatever dividends or capital gains actually accrue to the companies, the individuals themselves pay taxes as well. So it's an important point to remember that corporate tax is paid first, and then whatever is left as dividends and capital gains is then taxed after. So, and one of the important things that we therefore have to recognize is that there is therefore double taxation which needs to be kept in mind when you compare individual taxes to corporate taxes. Not quite right to compare those because of this additional layer. So recognizing this aspect and recognizing that it's really the risk-return trade-off, the risk and the after-tax return that investors look at, which is what really governs investment. We basically the government went ahead and reduced the corporate tax rates, which as we would recognize is a necessary but not sufficient condition, as I just mentioned on the regarding the virtuous cycle, that it's the anticipation of consumption that then basically fosters investment. That's what will provide the sufficiency condition. Together with that, there are a few other important developments. The cabinet just approved the Code on Industrial Relations. There are, at this point, there were about 40 odd different pieces of laws and legislation that govern the employment relationship. With, something as simple as wages being defined, in a different way across these pieces of legislation, which made it difficult for compliance, and also made enforcement, lot more difficult. What the government has embarked upon is to try and, subsume these 40 different pieces of legislation across 4 codes. The Code on Wages, which has already been passed by Parliament, the Code on Industrial Relations, which the Cabinet has approved and will go up, in Parliament for approval, Code on Occupational Safety, and Code on Social Security. These will enable to, it will enable investment by making the employer-employment relationship, less deterred, less affected by frictions, which is one, a very important element in fostering investment. The third important element in fostering investment is capital, especially debt capital. And here's where I actually want to focus on some key reforms that have been done over the last few years, and especially last few weeks, which are really important and have, important effects, salutary effects in the next few years in terms of the credit culture that will prevail in this country. You all recognize the Bankruptcy Code, which is really critical. I think we all understand the importance of a Bankruptcy Code. If, for instance, I take a loan to buy a car, and if I know very well that even if I do not repay that loan, my car is not going to be taken away, then except a few individuals who may feel, conscious or duty bound to repay, the rest of them may not be as indulgent. So the Bankruptcy Code thereby creating the threat for corporates of losing control is really critical. In this context, I think the SR judgment that has been passed by the Supreme Court is very, very important. And I must actually, as a parenthetical comment, mention that we were being impatient about the time that it was taking for some of these pieces to come through. What is really important to keep in mind is the United States was one of the first countries to enact the Bankruptcy Code. They did it in 1978. And for the legal jurisprudence to settle down, it took them 5 years. 5 years for the legal jurisprudence to settle down. We've been able to do within a space of 3 years. So that's something we should, be cognizant of and feel happy about, because do recognize that a Bankruptcy Code is an important change in the way in which credit gets administered in the system, and such important changes actually do take some time to settle down. So that's the SR judgment is very important, because it does 2 things. One, actually emphasizes the primacy of financial creditors over operational creditors, which is important for credit, and second, it also actually establishes the institution of the Committee of Creditors in making decisions relating to reorganization, both of which are very, very central to the Bankruptcy Code. The second bit that I'll focus on, which the Securities and Exchange Board of India, a couple of weeks back, has come up with the legislation that defaults need to be a listed company. If there is a default on its loan, it needs to share this, it needs to actually reveal it to the exchanges. I think this is a very important piece of regulation. Just to give you the best practice that prevails across the world. So if a corporate takes a bank loan, there are what are called covenants, which is that the loan has restrictions saying that, let's say, the long-term debt to EBITDA should not rise above a certain threshold, and many other covenants. The international practice is that even if one of the covenants is violated, that constitutes a technical default. And a technical default has to be revealed to the exchanges because it's material event. It's a material event. Investors need to know about such material events. Now, if you see this particular piece of this notification that the Securities and Exchange Board of India has brought in, you have to see it in that light, that the best practice internationally is to inform even on technical defaults. And the deterrent effect that it creates is because the company knows very well when this piece of information, when it will go to the to the exchanges, that will have an impact, will bring down equity prices and debt prices. Anticipating that, the corporation actually then tries its very best to sort of not even have technical default, let alone actual default. The deterrent effect that it creates is significant. In that context, having to disclose default that happens is very important, because markets function based on information. And when there isn't information, we economists actually use this term called asymmetric information, the problem of asymmetric information, which is something that actually spooks markets. And so this particular piece of regulation will really help in bringing that discipline in markets, because information now will flow a lot more continuously, and the deterrent effect that it will create for corporates to actually adhere to their timelines would be something that is really important. The long run impact of developing credit markets would be significant in this context. So when you take what we've done on bankruptcy together with this particular piece of legislation, I think those are very important. One other aspect that I want to highlight is that once the information is revealed that suppose a company has not been able to repay, then that also will impact the way the banks that have lent to these borrowers, the way they will have to provision, and thereby it will bring discipline in the banks as well in the way they have to treat these assets. So overall, when you take these together, the impact on credit markets is significant. So what I want to really summarize and present before you is that the current situation has really provided us an opportunity to try and bring in important structural reforms. I spoke about the corporate tax rate cut, which is important for investment. I emphasized the labor reforms, which are also important for, because it's an important factor of production, and also talked about capital, especially, debt capital and credit markets, all three of which are very important for investment to be furthered and bringing in long-run discipline. So I definitely, am confident that these important structural reforms that we've undertaken will definitely have an impact on investment and thereby on the other parts of the virtuous cycle that I've talked about. So good times are ahead. Thank you.